The long-awaited summer break had finally arrived. For the first time in months, I had the house to myself. I'm an 18-year-old college fresher. And summer was my chance to enjoy some much-needed solitude. My father, John, had left on a 2-month business trip the week before. And my mother, Isabel, had just returned from visiting her sister for a couple of days. She barely stayed home for more than an hour before rushing out to catch up with an old friend. As I watched her drive away, an overwhelming sense of freedom washed over me. The house was mine, and I knew exactly how I wanted to spend my time. The moment my mom's car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and went straight to my bedroom. I didn't waste a second. The house was still, the silence around me only amplifying the excitement that buzzed in my chest. There was something incredibly liberating about knowing no one would interrupt me for hours. I kicked off my clothes, grabbed a bottle of lotion and some tissues from my nightstand, and booted up my computer. As the screen flickered to life, I opened my favorite adult websites, fully prepared to indulge in a long, uninterrupted session of self-pleasure. It had been a while since I'd had the chance to completely let go like this. College life had kept me busy, and privacy in a shared dorm was a luxury I rarely had. Now, I'm back. The house was mine, and the next few hours were dedicated entirely to myself. Time flew by. I had lost myself in the moment, the sounds of the videos on my screen filling the room as I switched between different sites, each one more tantalizing than the last. I took short breaks to recharge, but I always found myself drawn back, eager for more. Before I knew it, 4 hours had passed. Usually my mom would stay out much longer when visiting her friends, often catching up on every piece of gossip she could get her hands on. But today, it seemed her social hour had ended sooner than usual. Oblivious to the time, I continued my routine, completely immersed in my private world. The headphones I had on blocked out any external noise, making me unaware of my surroundings. I was so focused that I didn't even hear the sound of the front door opening. Suddenly, without warning, my mother's voice pierced through my headphones, filled with shock and disbelief. "Oh my God! Noah! What are you doing? Stop that right now!" Panic surged through my body, freezing me in place. My heart pounded in my chest as my hands flew to the keyboard, frantically trying to close the windows on my screen. But it was too late. Mom had already seen everything. Her face was a mix of horror and embarrassment as she stood there, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. I sat there, paralyzed by shame and disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was as if time itself had slowed down, each second stretching into an eternity. Mom didn't say another word. She turned on her heel and rushed out of the room, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of my embarrassment. For a few minutes, I couldn't move. The shock of the situation had left me rooted to the spot, unable to process the full gravity of what had just transpired. How could I face her now? What could I possibly say to explain myself? My mind raced, cycling through a million excuses, but none of them felt right. There was no excuse for what had happened. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to leave my room. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way down the hallway, each step bringing me closer to an inevitable confrontation with my mother. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her back to me. Her posture was stiff, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't look up as I entered the room. "Mom," I started, my voice trembling with guilt and regret. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you'd be home so early. I didn't mean for you to see that. It won't happen again. I promise." Isabel didn't respond immediately. For a moment, she just sat there in silence, staring down at the floor. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. Her voice quiet but firm. I don't even know what to say. Noah, she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. I thought you were more responsible than this. I didn't expect to come home and see that. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than anything else. I had always been close with my mom, and the thought of letting her down like this was unbearable. I'm really sorry, Mom, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. It won't happen again. I swear. She stood up from the couch, her expression softening slightly. But the awkwardness between us remained. I need some time to process this, she said quietly, avoiding eye contact. Let's just try to forget about it for now. And with that, she walked into the kitchen, leaving me standing there, feeling more ashamed than I ever had in my entire life. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. We ate dinner together, but neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, and every glance in her direction only reminded me of the humiliating moment we had shared earlier. Despite my best efforts to move past the incident, I couldn't shake the lingering embarrassment. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the shocked look on my mom's face, replaying the moment over and over again in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about how much things had changed between us in just a few short hours. The easygoing relationship I had once had with my mom now felt strained, as if an invisible barrier had been erected between us. The morning after the incident, I woke up feeling uneasy, the weight of yesterday's event still heavy on my shoulders. It wasn't just the embarrassment anymore. There was a growing tension in the house that I couldn't ignore. I knew that things couldn't just go back to normal, but I wasn't sure what would come next. My relationship with my mom had always been close, but now it felt like there was an awkward distance between us that hadn't been there before. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to work up the courage to face her. Part of me wanted to hide out in my room all day, avoiding any chance of another uncomfortable conversation. But I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. At some point, we would have to address what had happened. Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed and headed to the kitchen, where I found my mom already up, making breakfast. She moved around the kitchen with a sense of purpose, but there was an undeniable stiffness to her movements, as though she was trying to act normal, but couldn't quite pull it off. I could tell she was still processing what had happened the day before. "Good morning," I said hesitantly, my voice breaking with silence. She glanced at me briefly, giving me a small, strained smile. "Morning, Noah," she replied, her tone polite, but distant. "Do you want some breakfast?" "I made eggs." I nodded, though my appetite was practically non-existent. "Sure. Thanks." We sat at the kitchen table, eating in near silence, the sound of forks scraping against plates the only noise in the room. It was painfully awkward, and I felt like I should say something, anything, to break the tension. But what could I say that wouldn't make things worse? Every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words got caught in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, my mom finally broke the silence. "Noah," she began, her voice careful and measured. "About yesterday. I think we need to talk." I froze, my fork hovering midair. This was the conversation I had been dreading. "Yeah." I said quietly. I figured. She set down her fork. Her hands clasped together on the table in front of her. Look. I know you're an adult now. And you're entitled to your privacy. What happened yesterday? It was an accident. I came home earlier than I expected. And you didn't know I was there. I get it. Her words were surprisingly understanding. And I felt a small sense of relief wash over me. And maybe this conversation wouldn't be as bad as I had feared. She continued, her eyes locking with mine. You have to understand that what I walked in on was, well, it was shocking for me. I wasn't prepared to see that. And I need you to be more mindful of when and where you know? She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I shifted in my seat, feeling just as awkward. I know. Mom. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean for you to see any of that. I didn't know you'd be home so soon. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. I understand. I want us to be able to move past this. Okay? I don't want things to be weird between us. Her words hung in the air. And I felt a pang of guilt. She was trying so hard to be understanding. To make this less awkward for both of us. I appreciated that. But I also knew that things would never quite be the same. The dynamic between us had shifted. And there was no going back to how things were before. Yeah. I agreed, forcing a small smile. I don't want things to be weird either. We lapsed back into silence. But it felt a little less heavy this time. My mom finished her breakfast and stood up, clearing her plate from the table. I have to run a few errands today, she said, her tone casual as if she were trying to steer the conversation back to normalcy. Do you need anything from the store? I shook my head. No. I'm good. Thanks. As she left the kitchen, I exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The conversation had gone better than I'd expected. But the awkwardness between us still lingered. I couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a new, strange chapter in our relationship. For the next few days, I tried to avoid any situation that might lead to another awkward encounter with my mom. I spent most of my time in my room, either scrolling through my phone or playing video games to keep my mind off what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the memory of that day. The look on my mom's face when she walked in, the embarrassment that followed, the awkward silence that hung between us during meals. Despite my efforts to return to sense of normalcy, there was no denying that things had changed between us. Every interaction with my mom felt strained, as though we were both tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, too afraid to address it head-on. Even casual conversations felt forced, like we were both trying too hard to pretend everything was fine. It didn't help that every time I saw her, I was reminded of what had happened. I could still feel the heat of embarrassment rising in my cheeks whenever I thought about it. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. And it was a feeling that didn't seem to fade with time. One evening, about a week after the incident, my mom and I sat down to dinner. The tension between us had eased slightly, but there was still an underlying awkwardness that neither of us could ignore. We ate in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Then out of nowhere my mom spoke up. Noah, I've been thinking, she began, her voice measured, about what happened last week. I nearly choked on my food, my heart skipping a beat at the mention of the incident. I had hoped we could just let it fade into the background. But apparently, she had other plans. Yeah, I said cautiously, not sure where this conversation was headed. She set down her fork and looked at me. Her expression serious but calm. I know this is awkward for both of us. But I don't want you to feel like you have to hide anything from me. You're at an age where, well, your body has certain needs. And I understand that. I blinked. Not sure if I was hearing her correctly. Was she really saying what I thought she was saying? She continued. Her tone gentle but firm. I don't want you to feel ashamed about it. It's natural. But I also don't want to walk in on you again. So maybe we can set some boundaries? You can let me know when you need some privacy. And I'll make sure to give you that space. I stared at her, dumbfounded. This was not the conversation I had expected to have. My mom had always been open and understanding. But this felt like a whole new level of candidness. I didn't know how to respond. Yeah. Sure. I mumbled, still trying to wrap my head around what she was saying. She smiled, seemingly satisfied with my response. Good. I just want you to be comfortable. Noah. That's all. I nodded, still feeling a little shell-shocked by the conversation. It was strange, but in a weird way. Her openness made me feel a little less awkward. She wasn't mad. And she wasn't disgusted. She was just trying to be supportive in her own way. After dinner, I retreated to my room, my mind buzzing with thoughts. Things between us had shifted once again. And while it still felt weird, I couldn't deny that her acceptance had made the situation a little easier to handle. The days continued to pass. And slowly, the tension between my mom and me began to ease. We still weren't back to how things used to be. There was an unspoken barrier between us that hadn't existed before. At least we were no longer tiptoeing around the house in total silence. Conversations became more natural. And the awkwardness that had once filled the air started to dissipate. Yet, even though things seemed to be improving on the surface, there was still an underlying tension that neither of us could shake. It was during one of those quiet afternoons when things took another unexpected turn. I was sitting in my room, headphones on, as usual, watching one of my favorite videos. I had become more cautious lately, making sure the door was locked and always keeping an ear out for any sounds in the hallway. But today, I had let my guard down. I was so engrossed in the video that I didn't hear my mom's footsteps approaching the door. Without warning, the door swung open. And before I could react, there she was, standing in the doorway. My heart nearly stopped. Noah, she said softly, but with an edge of curiosity in her voice. What are you watching? I scrambled to close the video, my face flushing with embarrassment. Mom. Ida. It's nothing. I stammered, trying to cover the screen with my hand. She didn't seem fazed, though. Her eyes flicked to the screen. And instead of turning around and walking out like I expected, she stepped into the room. My stomach dropped. Noah. You don't have to hide it from me, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. We've already talked about this. I told you it's okay. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she be so nonchalant about this? I couldn't even look her in the eye. I just didn't expect you to come in, I muttered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. She smiled softly and sat down on the edge of my bed, her eye still locked on the now blank screen of my computer. You don't have to be embarrassed. I understand. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. I had expected her to scold me, or at the very least, leave the room in embarrassment. But instead, she was sitting there, acting like this was a normal, everyday conversation. I told you. She continued. I'm not going to judge you for this. If you enjoy it, that's fine. But you don't have to feel like you need to hide it from me. I was at a complete loss for words. How was she so calm about this? My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, she said something that left me utterly speechless. If you want, she said slowly, I could watch with you. My heart nearly stopped. What? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She shrugged, as if it were the most casual suggestion in the world. Maybe if we watch together, it won't feel so awkward anymore. You won't feel like you're hiding something. I stared at her, my mind struggling to comprehend what she had just said. Watch together? How could she even suggest something like that? I don't know. Mom, I said, my voice shaky. That's kind of weird. Don't you think? She smiled again, her expression soft and understanding. I know it sounds strange, but I just want to help you feel comfortable. I don't want there to be any more secrets between us. I didn't know how to respond. On one hand, the idea was absolutely mortifying. But on the other hand, there was something strangely comforting about her willingness to be so open and accepting. It felt like she was trying to bridge the gap between us, to make things less awkward. I guess. I mumbled, still unsure of how to feel about the whole situation. She nodded as if she had expected my hesitation. We don't have to if you don't want to, she said gently. But just know that if you ever do, I'm here. With that, she stood up from the bed and headed toward the door. I'll be in the living room if you need anything, she said with a small smile. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in my room, my mind spinning. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. My mom's unexpected openness had left me feeling confused, uncomfortable, and oddly intrigued all at once. Part of me wanted to pretend that the conversation had never happened, to move on and go back to how things used to be. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about her offer, about the strange, unsettling bond that seemed to be forming between us. It wasn't until a few days later that the situation took another unexpected turn. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was once again in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. My mom had been in and out of the house all day, running errands and keeping herself busy. But now she was sitting in the chair across from me, reading a book. The silence between us was comfortable. For the first time in a while, without thinking, I switched the TV to one of my usual channels, the kind of channel that played adult content late at night. I don't know why I did it. Maybe out of boredom. Maybe out of some strange curiosity about how she would react. I wasn't even sure if she noticed. But she did. Her eyes flicked up from her book, and she glanced at the screen. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for her to say something. But instead of the awkward silence or embarrassed reaction I had expected, she simply smiled. So, this is what you like to watch? She asked, her voice casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was reeling, my face burning with embarrassment. But before I could say anything, she stood up from her chair and walked over to the couch, sitting down next to me. You don't have to turn it off, she said softly. I told you. It's okay. I just want you to feel comfortable. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. My mom, sitting next to me on the couch, watching adult content together. It felt like a dream. No, a nightmare. But there was something strangely reassuring about her presence. Something that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as weird as it seemed. She leaned back on the couch, her eyes on the screen. You know, she said after a moment. When I was younger, I didn't have the internet to find these things. We had to rely on magazines or tapes. It's a different world now. I blinked, unsure how to respond. I guess, I said awkwardly, still trying to process the situation. We sat in silence for a while, watching the screen. The tension between us thick but strangely comfortable at the same time. I couldn't help but feel like we had crossed a line. But I didn't know how to turn back now. As the days went by, what had once felt like an awkward, almost unimaginable situation gradually began to feel strangely normal. The conversations I had with my mom, the moments we shared in front of the TV, even the unspoken understanding that had developed between us. It all started to feel like part of our routine. There was no denying that something had changed between us. And though I couldn't quite put my finger on it, I knew that our relationship had crossed into new territory. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, my mom called me into the living room. I had been holed up in my room, trying to distract myself with video games. But her voice pulled me out of my thoughts. As I walked down the hallway, I found her sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels on the TV. Noah, she began, her voice soft but serious. I think we need to talk. I froze in the doorway, my heart skipping a beat. We had already talked so much over the past few weeks. About boundaries. About privacy. About things that most mothers and sons would never dream of discussing. But something in her tone made me realize that this conversation was going to be different. I sat down across from her, unsure of what to expect. I've been thinking, she said slowly, her eyes focused on the TV screen, but not really watching it. About us. About what's been going on these past few weeks. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my mind racing. Where was she going with this? I know things have changed between us, she continued, her voice gentle but firm. And I know that some of the things we've done, some of the conversations we've had, they're not exactly normal. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. She was right. Of course. Our relationship had evolved into something that defied the usual boundaries between a mother and son. But at the same time, it didn't feel wrong. At least not in the way I thought it would. She went on, turning her gaze to meet mine. I want you to know that I'm still your mother and that will never change. What we've been doing, it's just me trying to be there for you. Trying to help you understand yourself. But I also realized that we need to set some limits. I felt a pang of anxiety at her words. Limits? What did she mean by that? She must have noticed the look on my face because she smiled softly, reassuringly. I don't want you to worry, Noah. I'm not upset. I just think it's important that we both understand what's happening here. I don't want you to feel confused. And I don't want things to get out of hand. Out of hand? I wasn't sure how to interpret that. What do you mean? I asked hesitantly. She sighed, her expression thoughtful. I mean that we need to be careful. This is a delicate situation. And I don't want either of us to end up feeling uncomfortable or regretful. I want to make sure that we're both okay with this. With everything. Her words hung in the air. And I found myself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me was relieved that she was addressing the situation head-on. But another part of me felt a growing sense of unease. What exactly was she suggesting? That we stop? That we pretend none of this had ever happened? I'm okay, I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. I mean, I'm fine with it. It's just different. She nodded, her expression softening. I know. And I want you to know that I'm here for you. No matter what. But we have to be honest with ourselves. Noah. This can't go on forever. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This can't go on forever. Of course. She was right. As much as I had grown accustomed to this new dynamic, as much as I had come to rely on her openness and support, I knew that this wasn't sustainable. It was only a matter of time before things had to change. I understand, I said quietly, though the truth was I wasn't sure I did. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip gentle but firm. I love you, Noah. And I want you to be happy. I just don't want either of us to lose sight of what's important. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I love you too, Mom. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, her hand resting in mine, the weight of our conversation hanging heavily in the air. And though nothing more was said, I knew that everything had changed once again. After that conversation, things between my mom and me shifted once more. The openness and strange sense of comfort that had developed between us began to wane, replaced by an unspoken understanding that things couldn't stay the way they were. We both knew it, though neither of us said it out loud. It was as if we were both waiting for the inevitable. A return to normalcy. Or at least something resembling it. The following week, my dad was scheduled to return from his business trip. His arrival loomed over the house like a dark cloud. A reminder that whatever strange bond my mom and I had formed was about to come to an abrupt end. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. The tension between us spoke volumes. One evening, just a few days before Dad's return, my mom knocked on my bedroom door. I was sitting at my desk, pretending to study but really just staring blankly at the screen. Her knock startled me, and I quickly turned around to see her standing in the doorway, a soft smile on her face. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat on the edge of my bed. She sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unusually serious. "Noah, I've been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. This was it. The conversation I had been dreading. "Okay," I said quietly, bracing myself for what was to come. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Your dad is coming home soon. And we both know that things are going to change when he gets back. We can't keep doing what we've been doing." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Yeah. I know." She gave me a sad smile. "I'm going to miss this, Noah. As strange as it sounds, these past few weeks have brought us closer than I ever thought possible. But I also know that it's time to move on. We have to go back to how things were before." Her words stung, but I knew she was right. Our strange arrangement couldn't last forever. And as much as I had come to rely on her in ways I never imagined, I also knew that this was the right thing to do. "I'll miss it, too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I understand. I understand." She reached out and took my hand, her grip warm and comforting. "I just want you to know that I'll always be here for you. No matter what. Even if things go back to normal. That doesn't mean I won't be there for you when you need me." Her words brought a lump to my throat, and I had to fight back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate everything." She leaned in and kissed my forehead. a gesture that felt both tender and bittersweet. I love you, Noah. Always. I love you too, Mom. With that, she stood up and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. And I realized that this chapter of my life, the one that had brought me closer to my mom in ways I had never imagined, was coming to an end. The day had arrived. My dad was finally coming home from his business trip. The house, which had been a strange and quiet place for the past few weeks, was now filled with a nervous energy that I couldn't shake. I hadn't realized just how much my life had changed during the time he had been away. And now that he was coming back, I couldn't help but feel a sense of impending finality. My mom had spent the morning cleaning the house, making everything look perfect for his return. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, her usual routine somehow comforting. I stayed out of the way, not wanting to get in the middle of her preparations. It felt strange, knowing that in just a few hours, the life I'd grown accustomed to would change once again. As the clock ticked closer to his arrival, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. I was excited to see my dad. Of course, I had missed him during his long absence. But there was also a sense of loss that weighed heavily on me. The strange bond that had developed between my mom and me. The openness. The understanding. It would all have to go back to the way it was before. Finally, around 5 p.m. the sound of the front door opening signaled his arrival. I could hear his voice as he called out, "Honey, I'm home." The familiar sound sent a wave of nostalgia through me. But it was tinged with something bittersweet. My mom rushed to the door to greet him, her smile wide and genuine. I stood in the hallway, watching as they embraced. They looked so happy to see each other. And for a moment, I felt like an outsider in my own home. The dynamic between them was so natural, so familiar. And yet it felt foreign to me after everything that had happened. "Noah," my dad called out as he spotted me standing there. "Come here. Son. I've missed you." I forced a smile and walked over, giving him a quick hug. "I missed you too, Dad." As we stood there in the foyer, the three of us, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had transpired over the past few weeks. My dad had no idea what had gone on while he was away. He had no idea that my relationship with my mom had shifted in ways I could never explain. And now, it was up to us to pretend that everything was normal. Dinner that night was like something out of a sitcom. My dad regaling us with stories of his trip. My mom laughing at all the right moments. The two of them acting as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything felt different. I could barely focus on the conversation, my mind constantly drifting back to the unspoken bond between my mom and me. As the night wore on, I realized just how much I had grown accustomed to the strange new dynamic between us. But now that my dad was home, there was no room for that anymore. Things had to go back to the way they were. And as much as I had braced myself for this, it still hurt. After dinner, I retreated to my room, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. The house felt different now. More crowded. More stifling. The freedom I had once felt had been replaced by a sense of confinement. And I couldn't help but wonder how I was supposed to move forward from here. The days following my dad's return were a blur. The house was filled with the usual noise and activity that came with having both parents home. And slowly, the strange summer I had shared with my mom began to fade into the background. It was as though we had made an unspoken agreement to leave it behind, to let it drift into the past where it belonged. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when the memory of that time would resurface. A glance exchanged across the dinner table. A brief touch on the shoulder. A quiet smile shared in passing. These moments reminded me of the bond we had forged, of the openness that had once existed between us. And though we never spoke of it, I knew that my mom felt it too. One afternoon, about a week after my dad's return, my mom and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. My dad had gone out to run errands, leaving the house quiet and still. I was sitting at the table, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, while my mom busied herself with the dishes. The silence between us was comfortable, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't ignore. It was as though we were both waiting for the other to say something, to acknowledge the unspoken bond that still lingered between us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mom spoke. "Noah," she said softly, her back still turned to me as she rinsed a plate under the faucet. "I just wanted to thank you." I looked up, confused. For what? She turned off the water and turned to face me, her expression soft and thoughtful. "For understanding. For being so mature about everything. I know this summer has been unusual to say the least, but I'm proud of how you've handled it." Her words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The honesty in her voice, the vulnerability in her eyes. It was a side of her that I hadn't seen before. Not like this. I didn't really have a choice, I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. She smiled. A sad, knowing smile. "Maybe not. But you've grown so much. Noah. I just want you to know that I'll always be here for you. No matter what." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Thanks, Mom. I appreciate that." For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything we had been through hanging in the air between us. And then, as if sensing that the moment had passed, she turned back to the sink and resumed washing the dishes. The conversation felt like a quiet farewell, a way of acknowledging that the chapter we had shared was truly over. And though it hurt to let it go, I knew that it was the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. My dad settled back into his usual routine, and the strange summer I had shared with my mom became little more than a distant memory. We never spoke about it again. And over time, the bond we had forged began to fade, replaced by the more traditional mother-son relationship we had always known. But despite the return to normalcy, I couldn't help but feel that something had changed within me. The openness and understanding that had developed between my mom and me had shaped me in ways I hadn't expected. I had grown, matured, and come to understand myself in a way that I never had before. As I prepared to return to college for my second year, I found myself reflecting on the summer that had passed. It was a strange, surreal time, filled with moments that had tested my understanding of boundaries, relationships, and trust. But it had also been a time of growth, both for me and for my mom. And though our relationship would never be quite the same as it had been before that summer, I knew that we had both emerged stronger because of it. The bond we had shared, the understanding we had reached. It would always be a part of us, even if we never spoke of it again. As I packed my bags and prepared to leave for school, my mom stood in the doorway, watching me with a soft smile on her face. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. "Yeah, I'm ready." She stepped forward and pulled me into a tight hug, holding me close for a long moment. "I'm going to miss you, Noah." "I'll miss you too, Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion. When she finally let go, I could see the sadness in her eyes. There was also a sense of pride. She had helped me grow in ways that neither of us could have predicted. And for that, I was grateful. As I walked out the door, my suitcase in hand, I knew that this summer had changed me. It had taught me about love, trust, and the complexities of relationships. And though it was over, the lessons I had learned would stay with me for the rest of my life. The summer that began with awkward misunderstandings had turned into something far more profound. A journey of self-discovery, trust, and boundaries. Noah's relationship with his mother evolved in ways neither of them could have predicted. But ultimately, it brought them closer, while teaching them valuable lessons about love, acceptance, and personal growth. As we close this chapter, we're left with a lingering question. How would you handle a relationship that pushes the boundaries of what's considered normal? Could you ever look at someone the same way after crossing those invisible lines? Transcribed, let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts. And hit that subscribe button to join our community. We've got more gripping stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to know when our next video drops.